anymore. When the truth is relative, the only allowable intolerance is intolerance. And the highest possible value, the only thing that we could preach, is coexistence. And is that really what Jesus advocates here? The problem with that assumption is it doesn't fit the context of the passage. The context of the passage is Jesus is talking about a righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees. And he's going to go on, incidentally, to talk about all of the ways in which we as disciples need to exercise good judgment. Truth and righteousness matter. But for some people, simply speaking the truth or acknowledging that there is righteousness is itself an act of judgmentalism. Jesus is addressing a very certain assumption of superiority, the right to look down on others and to sort them into classes, to make those distinctions about them. And here he gets into the meat of it. In verse 3, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? One of the great word pictures that Jesus gives us. So there's a speck of dust in your brother's eye, and you've got like this 2x4 in yours. But you're going to remove the speck from your brother's eye. What are we talking about? What kind of judgment are we talking about? Well, healthy judgment is humble judgment. First thing, we need to understand that healthy judgment actually exists, that it is good to exercise good, healthy judgment. But we have to have some perspective. We have to, for starters, acknowledge that we ourselves are sinners. And so that we cannot come into this relationship with another person from the attitude of, I am superior to you, I am more righteous than you. Note that the passage remove the speck from your brother's eye. And then you'll be able to deal with the speck in your. In other words, healthy judgment is a judgment that is exercised from a place of humility, a place of great mercy, and a place of great love. Now, some people probably here today think that finding fault is their spiritual gift. There's a few in every congregation. That's my spiritual gift. That's my superpower. I'll tell you something about finding fault right now. It's not hard to find fault. And do you know why? We all have them. So the only thing that we have to do in order to find fault in one another is look for them. And what we tend to do is we develop a negative impression about somebody, we get upset with them, and then we go looking for all the things that are their faults, and so we can kind of justify maintaining that negativity towards them. Well, that's judgmentalism. That's that broken approach. The question is, when we recognize faults in other people, are we doing that in order to lift them up, to help them become more Christ-like? Or are we doing it to somehow elevate ourselves by keeping them lower than us? That's the difference between healthy judgment and unhealthy judgment. Jesus addresses the hypocrisy of spiritual elitism because their judgment comes without love, without mercy. It is meant to elevate them in their position, to make them feel superior to others. And much of the text of the chapter that we're looking at today is really about exercising healthy judgment, or if you're not comfortable with that word, you could substitute the word discernment. It's about basically being able to look at the world and make some determinations about what is right and what is wrong. Disciples, according to Jesus, must, in fact, exercise judgment, because there are a lot of things in the world that need to be evaluated in the light of kingdom truth and kingdom righteousness. You need to be aware as you make your way through this world of what is in fact right and righteous. What is in fact the truth of God versus the lies of the world. Disciples must exercise good, healthy judgment in evaluating these things. So in verse 6, he says, "Do not give to dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces." And so disciples must exercise judgment with those who repeatedly reject the truth. This word picture is a little bit vague. Peter, quoting the prophets, gives us a little deeper sense of what Jesus is saying. Peter says that a dog returns to its vomit, and a pig returns to its mud, returns to its slop. The truth and the righteousness of the kingdom are precious. And there are some people who will be unable, unwilling to recognize how precious they are. We are dog people. We always have one or more dogs. And we've been fortunate. Most of our dogs have been mutts, and we've been fortunate to have some really good mutts. Dogs that just were protective of the family, and were just good dogs, good personality and all that sort of thing. And for many years, we had a dog we called Jack the dog. Jack was a Jack Russell Corgi mix. I don't know if you could replicate it ever again. He was a little, mostly white dog with eyeliner around his eyes and brown head, and he lived to a ripe old age. We had him most of the years that we were in Colorado and a few years after we moved out here. Jack the dog was our bear chasing dog, even though he was not quite a foot high. He chased bears off of the property. He was just a good dog. But Jack the dog was also gross. We would get elk coming through the yard. If you're not familiar with elk, that's like a deer on steroids. Elk are about the size of a small cow with longer legs, and they would come through the yard in big herds, and they would leave prizes behind for us when they left. Jack the dog would go find these prizes, these piles of poo, and roll around in them. I'm sure that there's some evolutionary explanation for why dogs do this. I can't fathom what that would be. Jack the dog would come running into the house, his white coat suddenly looking sort of a greenish brown, and he'd be smelling like a backed up toilet. We're like, "Jack that dog, you did it again." And here's the thing. Jack the dog would immediately be dragged downstairs and put in a bathtub against his will. We would clean him off until his nice white coat come back. He looked all beautiful, but then you would have to keep him in the house, or he would immediately go right back out to the same pile and roll in it again. That's the metaphor that we're using here. That's the metaphor that Jesus is employing. Don't take these precious things that you have and cast them to people who are just going to reject them and go back to the nonsense, go back to the brokenness. And folks, every one of you has known people who should know better, who've heard the truth, who've heard the gospel, who've heard the hope of the kingdom, and who repeatedly go back to filth. This is a hard message, because it almost sounds like Jesus is challenging us to give up on people. But I don't think that's the case at all. Jesus is making the case that if you continue to offer these precious things to people who don't want to, or are not ready, or are unable to hear them, you'll only frustrate them until they turn on you. And we are better off sometimes by turning people over to their brokenness and allowing them to experience the consequences of their choices. Folks, if you have friends who find themselves in a broken lifestyle, do not protect them from the choices they've made. Allow them to experience the consequences of that because their soul may depend upon it. It may be the only hope of returning back to truth. Repetition will be ineffective and very likely will stir up bitterness. Leaving to them to their folly may be the only hope that they have. But this requires that we exercise good judgment, that we have discernment of the situation. Where do we get that? Verse 7 and 8, Jesus says, "Ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks the door will be open." Disciples have to exercise healthy judgment in their search for truth. If righteousness requires that there is a judgment, and judgment requires that there is an objective truth, where do you find the truth? Jesus says, ask God the Father, and He'll give it to you. Seek the truth, and you will find it. Knock on His door, and He'll answer His door. He'll do this because He gives good gifts. He always gives good gifts. You come to Him asking for something, you want the truth, He'll give you the truth. But sometimes we're not always sure that we want the truth. But if you go to God asking for the truth, seeking the truth, He will provide it to you. Remember when I was a kid, one year at Christmas, I wanted Legos. And I got a box of blocks on Christmas morning. They were bricks blocks. They were a cheaper version of Legos, a knockoff of Legos, bricks blocks. I wasn't a picky kid. I was very excited to have my box of blocks. But as soon as I went to play Legos with friends, quickly realized these blocks are not compatible. They're not the same thing. They're a knockoff. When God gives gifts, He doesn't give knockoffs. He doesn't go cheap. He goes seeking the truth. He'll give you the truth, even if it's not the truth that you thought you wanted to find. Then He goes on, He says, "So, in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets." We know this as the golden rule. It starts with so, or therefore. Because of what I just told you, now let me tell you something else. So because God